Okay. Perfect. Okay, so this is Claire Hart, and she's been involved in English language teaching since 2005. Having worked as a secondary teacher, a university instructor, and communication coach for in-work adult learners. So Claire began combining materials writing with teaching and teacher training 10 years ago. Claire's current focus is on creating high quality and inclusive ELT materials and on using her lived experience as an autistic woman to help other educators understand what it means to be a neurologically diverse human being and learner. So all of that wealth of experience means that we're extremely excited and happy to have you here today, Claire, and I'm going to pass over to you. So I'm here if you need me, but you can start sharing your presentation now, and I'm going to disappear.
So, hello from me. It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening, or this evening for me. Maybe it's the morning or the afternoon for you. Yeah, and as Joe mentioned, I'm very excited that I get to talk about neurodiversity in ELT today, because I have, a really strong personal connection to the topic as someone who's been an ELT educator for many years, as someone who is neurologically diverse, and as someone who is a parent of neurologically diverse children. So that's the point of view that I'm coming at this topic from, with these three different hats on. And yeah, the topic we're going to be looking at is understanding and accommodating neurodiversity. As I'll mention later, I believe that there can be no accommodation without understanding, and accommodation is essential to create an inclusive classroom where everyone can flourish. Okay, so let me show you what the plan is for the next hour or so. Okay, first of all, I want to look a little bit closer at what is neurodiversity exactly, because as you might know, this is a term which has been coined relatively recently, within the last few years. And to be honest, we don't even know for sure if we're going to keep using this term into the future. Maybe as research in the field develops, maybe we'll find a more appropriate term. But for now, we have this term neurodiversity. We're going to look a little bit deeper into what that is exactly and what the term neurodiversity means to people who are neurodiverse. Okay, so that brings me on to my second point, the perception of neurodiversity versus the reality of neurodiversity. And as you can imagine, if there's a mismatch between the perception and the reality, that usually leads to the needs of neurologically diverse people not being met. So it's important to look at that. Okay, and then connected to that, what does it mean to accommodate neurodiversity? Like, it sounds simple, it sounds logical. Yeah, of course, we must accommodate the needs of people who have needs that not all students have. But what does that actually mean? What is the kind of payback there? And then finally, practical tips for any classroom where there are neurologically diverse students. And as Elsa was just saying in her talk before mine, those things that teachers can do in the case of neurologically diverse students are also things which will benefit any classroom. And they're often things that teachers will be, or at least should be, doing anyway. They're not radical. It doesn't require you to, tear up every lesson plan and completely rearrange your classroom. Okay, so let's move on to the first point. What is neurodiversity? So I'm very aware that we have a wide breadth of people in the webinar from all over the world, which is fantastic. And I'm sure we also have a wide range of different kind of knowledge or experience levels when it comes to neurodiversity. Perhaps some of you are neurologically diverse yourself, or you have children or other relatives who are. Maybe you work with students who are neurologically diverse, or maybe you have read quite a bit about neurological diversity, or perhaps you're coming at this from the perspective of someone who is just curious and does not have so much experience with neurodiversity. That is all completely fine. Very happy to have that spectrum. So I thought I would ask you to start with, what does neurodiversity mean to you? What would your answer to the question, what is neurodiversity, be? And if you want to just think about that yourself for a moment, perfectly fine, go ahead and do that. If you'd like to write your answer in the chat and share it with others and read other people's answers, that's also great. I'll leave it up to you, but I'll give you about 20 seconds just to think about that and type in an answer in the chat if you want to. Okay. It's not an easy question, I know, but I'm sure we can rise to the challenge. Okay, so I see some of you, unfortunately, I can't read everything in the chat at the moment, but I can see some of you are typing, which is great, thank you. But of course, if you don't want to share in the chat, that's also fine. Okay, so yeah, as I said earlier, without understanding, there can be no accommodation, and that's why there's the need for accommodation and understanding when it comes to neurodiversity. Here are some definitions of neurodiversity which exist. Okay, I'll put it like that. Neurodiversity is a framework for understanding human brain function and mental illness. So it's not anything of itself, but it is a way of understanding how brains might work. Another definition of neurodiversity is that it is the unique way that each person's brain develops. So if you're using this definition, then you're essentially saying that everyone is neurodiverse because everyone's brain is unique and slightly different. So there is, according to that definition, there was really no distinction between the neurologically diverse person, i.e. the person who has autism spectrum disorder or ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or dyslexia, and a person who does not have those disorders. Okay, and I really do not like using the term disorder for reasons you can imagine. Obviously, it's negative connotations, but that is the medical term which exists. And finally, neurodiversity could be seen as the different ways a person's brain processes information. Okay, i.e., if you are on the autism spectrum, your brain will process information in a different way to the brain of someone who is not. Okay, and in this situation, by information, we can also, it's not only, information as in facts and data, it's also information as in stimuli from the world around you and experiences from the world around you. In that sense, how does your brain process that? Okay, so what we can be sure about is that some people's brains function differently. Okay, I don't, on the other hand, and of course, here I'm speaking from my perspective and giving my opinion. Obviously, this is based on experience and reading and research I've done in this area. But from my perspective, it's a mistake to confuse neurodiversity and mental illness, because anyone can suffer from mental illness, regardless of how their brain has developed. Neurologically diverse people do often suffer from mental illness, depression, anxiety, for example. But we have to be careful when we we have to be careful not to confuse the terms neurodiversity and mental illness. Okay, mental illness can be a symptom of neurodiversity, but mental illness can also come and go in someone's life. And autism spectrum disorder is for life. Okay, it's not going to come and go. Okay, that's the heavy definition stuff out of the way. Okay, so yeah, of course, the question is, how do we, and by we, I mean neurologically diverse people, feel about the term neurodiversity? What do you think about that? Do you think maybe you can get a hint at how I feel about that from what I've just said? But maybe just think about that for a second or two. How do you think neurologically diverse people, as they have been labeled, feel about the term neurodiversity? Do you think they're happy with it, are cool with it, support it? You can write your answer in the chat if you want, and you can also read other people's answers there. Do you think they would have anything against that, or would they embrace it? Obviously, everyone's different, but how do you think they might respond to that? Yeah, obviously I don't want to generalize here, but yeah, there are differences of opinion. Okay, well, on the one hand, some neurologically diverse people would say, yes, I like the term neurodiversity because it recognizes that our differences are due to neurological and not emotional or social divergences. And it's also saying, you know, just because you have autism or ADHD, that does not mean that you are abnormal. You are part of the spectrum, which includes all humans. Okay, so in that sense, it's very inclusive, and I can also appreciate that. On the other hand, some advocates in the field of neurologically diverse people strongly object to the term neurological diversity because it can suggest a normality that they find offensive and inappropriate. So it's kind of suggesting, or at least in some people's opinion, it's kind of minimizing the negative effects on people's lives that being neurologically diverse can have. And they think, you know, that's not okay. That's not the reality. Okay, and you should be focusing more on the reality and the struggle of people who are neurologically diverse. Okay, I can kind of see both points of view. I don't think I'm firmly on either side of the fence there. Okay, so yeah, before we go any further, we need to clarify some key points here. Neurodiverse or neurologically diverse, it's often shortened to ND in discussions, means, yeah, having a brain that functions differently to the established norm for a brain, okay? Neurotypical or neurologically typical, having a brain that functions in line with the established norm. I think that's the simplest way that I can put it. Mental health, on the other hand, is your psychological and emotional well-being. So obviously every person has psychological and emotional well-being, and this can vary and change over time for better or for worse. And then the three main areas of neurodiversity, which I mentioned earlier, autism spectrum disorder, often shortened to ASD, is a neurological and developmental condition which affects how people behave, how they learn, how they communicate. ADHD, which is short for attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, is also a neurological and developmental condition which affects how people behave, learn, and communicate. Of course, there are some features of ADHD which people with ASD tend not to have, but there's also a lot of crossover between the two. For example, something called rejection sensitivity dysphoria, which is essentially a kind of extreme sensitivity to the possibility of rejection and a kind of extreme kind of paranoia, if you like, a sense of paranoia connected to a fear of possible rejection, tends to be shared by both people with ASD and ADHD, for example. And a lot of people have both autism spectrum disorder and ADHD. Yeah. And some recent research has actually suggested that, you know, the similarities between the brains of people with ASD and ADHD are so great that it may possibly be that it makes no sense to separate the two. But we'll have to wait and see how that research develops in the future. Maybe there'll be some more evidence found which disputes that. And then dyslexia, I must admit, I have no personal experience with dyslexia. I have friends and colleagues with dyslexia who I've talked to about their experiences, but I don't have any personal experience of it. Also, I've never worked with any students who have it. But the British Dyslexia Society are happy to define it as a learning difficulty and one that primarily affects how people read and write. We'll talk a little bit later about whether ASD and ADHD are also learning difficulties or not. Okay, so moving on to the second part, perception versus the reality of neurodiversity. Okay, here's a very colorful photo of me on a train taken by my son, looking a bit unimpressed. But I like all the colors he used on the filter there. Yeah, so I wanted to share some perceptions of neurodiversity with you, which I have encountered. For example, he acts a bit autistic, or she, no reason for it necessarily to be he, acts a bit autistic. I've heard many times. And unfortunately, it makes me really sad to have to admit this, but unfortunately, he acts a bit autistic is usually used to mean, I think he has negative characteristics, as in, I think he is cold, or I think he has no empathy. But of course, is it possible to be a bit autistic? Of course not. You're either autistic or you're not. And of course, it's offensive to people who are autistic to say, to use autistic as a shorthand for cold or whatever negative attributes they want to connect there. Everyone has ADHD nowadays. You will also hear a lot due to the recent massive upsurge in the number of people, especially the number of adults being diagnosed with ADHD. Obviously, this is due to an increased awareness of what ADHD is, which is leading to more people seeking out a diagnosis of it, because no doctor is going to come around to your house and be like, oh, hi, I just go around to check if anyone here has ADHD. You want to do a quick test? Obviously, that doesn't happen. If you think you might have ADHD and you want a diagnosis, you have to go and seek it out yourself. You have to be proactive. And more people are being proactive in that way. But yeah, obviously the statement everyone has ADHD is, massive exaggeration. Clearly they don't. Also, one which unfortunately I've heard from my son's teachers at school is, I used to work with autistic people in a residential home. So there we have the perception that the perception of the autistic, especially person, as being someone who is unable to live independently, people who need care, people who are disabled, essentially, and unable to live independent lives. But, fortunately, this is not true for everyone with autism. There's a massive spectrum when it comes to autism. It's important that we don't minimize the experiences that some people have, but also, keep in mind that there are plenty of people who do not have that experience too. Okay. Yeah, so I wanted to just look at the pre-webinar task questionnaire, which I sent out, and it's fine if you didn't do this. But the question was whether these are myths or facts. Maybe we can have a quick look and see how well you did. So number one, neurodiverse individuals always struggle in mainstream schools. Is this a fact or a myth? If you didn't do this before, of course, you can think about it now. I would say this is a myth because there are plenty of neurodiverse individuals in mainstream schools who are not struggling. Although at the same time, I do not wish to diminish the experience of many children who do struggle at school. I know of neurodiverse children who really struggle at school because of the noise. They need some kind of ear protection to help them deal with that. And yeah, the main kind of disturbing factor for children at mainstream schools is the noise and being forced to wear uniform, for example, in the United Kingdom or other countries where students have to wear uniform can be very unpleasant. So yeah, there are some challenges for neurodiverse individuals in mainstream schools. They do struggle, but there are also many who don't, or whose struggle is able to be at a manageable level. Neurodiverse individuals either have very high or very low intelligence. So of course, there's the stereotype of the kind of Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang Theory, genius, very high intelligence, very poor social skills. Not all people who, my husband also has autism, and he is not as much as I love him, obviously, he's not the highly intelligent Sheldon Cooper type. He left school when he was 15 with essentially no academic qualifications. He's a genius at chess though, so his his brain clearly works pretty well. But the point is, we cannot necessarily assume that neurologically diverse people are automatically going to be either very high or very low intelligence. Some of them have kind of average intelligence. Do neurodiverse students find learning a foreign language more difficult than neurotypical students? Well, not necessarily. They actually might find it easier because they tend to have very good memory skills. For example, my son has just been learning Mandarin Chinese, which he is excellent at. So yeah, it's not necessarily true that they find learning a foreign language more difficult. Neurodiverse individuals always prefer to be alone. This is not true. We need our time alone, but we also feel rubbish if we spend too much time alone. We need contact with other people. There is just sometimes when that contact with other people becomes too much for us, and we need to withdraw and be alone. Number 5, neurodiverse individuals struggle to show empathy. It's not that they struggle to show empathy necessarily, it's just that they have a different way of showing empathy. For example, if someone tells me about something unpleasant that has happened to them, whatever it may be, I will respond by telling them a story of a similar unpleasant thing which happened to me, to kind of and my thinking there is that I'm going to reassure them that, you know, you are not alone. You're not the only person who has locked yourself out of your house. I have also done that. It's okay. It's not that we don't show empathy, it's just that we do it slightly differently to the norm, you could say. Okay, so the last 5. All neurodiverse individuals have very niche hobbies and interests. Well, this is a characteristic of especially autism spectrum disorder. People on the autism spectrum do tend to get a bit obsessed with specific things. Maybe the cliche is the kind of train spotting autistic person, but neurodiverse individuals' hobbies are not necessarily that niche. For example, I am quite obsessed with running, and I don't think that is really that niche. There are plenty of neurotypical people who also enjoy running, but they do have a tendency to get very interested and very obsessed with things. Students with dyslexia experience learning in a similar way to students with ADHD. Well, no, I would be careful about mixing, as I mentioned earlier. Let's not mix those together. Quite different kettles of fishes. Okay, and number 8, neurodiverse individuals vary between states of depression and hyperactivity. Well, people with ADHD do have a tendency to experience hyperactivity, but it's worth keeping in mind that this hyperactivity may not necessarily be physical hyperactivity, which is kind of the stereotype. It may be mental hyperactivity, which you're not able to see, so kind of overthinking. It's not necessarily true that, you know, we're constantly varying between not being able to get out of bed and being hyper and running around. Neurodiverse individuals prefer lessons with no structure where things can be improvised. Absolutely not. In fact, they want the opposite. They want lessons with lots of structure and no improvisation. That's what makes them feel safe and secure. Neurodiverse individuals usually do better on written tests than speaking or oral tests. Well, not necessarily. Perhaps they feel slightly more secure with the written test because they may feel that they have more control over what's happening. They can, to some extent, take things at their own pace. and they don't have the kind of social awkwardness which you could get from a speaking test. But in terms of their performance, there's no reason why they would necessarily perform worse. Okay, so as you can see, there are loads of ways in which people may misunderstand, stereotype neurologically diverse people. But if you try and move away from those stereotypes and assumptions, of course, you can get a better understanding of neurologically diverse students or any other neurologically diverse humans you encounter, for that matter. Okay, so this is a charming photo of me with no makeup on and surrounded by the mess of my living room. I'm being vulnerable here. What about me? What is going on with me? Well, I have hyperfocus. This is the reality, which means I'm able to focus on work or anything else I choose to do for long periods of time without a break. That can be good because it means that I can get things done quickly. It can be bad because it means I'm burnt out after doing that. Creativity, I'm pretty creative. I spend a lot of my time writing. Empathy, I'm a very empathetic person. But as I mentioned earlier, I may just show that in a way that you might not necessarily expect. I have an extreme fear of rejection, fear of the unknown. Fear of rejection, the typical thing is a colleague or boss asking to have a meeting with you without explaining why, and someone like me automatically assuming that they want to fire you or they don't want to work with you anymore, when in fact they might just want to praise you for some work you've done or talk about something else which is completely innocuous. Perfectionism, a lot of neurologically diverse people experience perfectionism, including me. And this can also lead to burnout and exhaustion because you're trying too hard to do things perfectly. And niche interests. I do have a couple of niche interests alongside the running, which is more mainstream. So yeah, bit of a history nerd, bit of a book nerd. Okay. So yeah, what does it mean? We've talked a lot about what is neurodiversity, and I'm glad that we have, and I'm glad that we've talked about those perceptions and hopefully debunked some myths. But what does it mean to accommodate neurodiversity? Oh, this is my son on a train, playing around with my iPad because he's bored. So the idea of accommodation suggests being forced to make changes in order to overcome an obstacle or obstacles. And in this case, the neurologically diverse student would be the obstacle. So this is clearly not a particularly positive way of presenting the accommodation of neurodiversity. But I don't think we have to see the neurologically diverse person as an obstacle in this case. Or what do you think? What does accommodation mean to you? Maybe you could think about that for about 20 seconds. And if you want to share your ideas in the chat and read other people's ideas, feel free. Or if you want to just think about it, fine. But yeah, I mean, I guess accommodation is a term that we bandy around quite a lot when it comes to inclusion in education. But it's interesting to just kind of think, well, what does it actually mean? Like, what do you actually do when you accommodate? What does accommodation actually look like? Is it really diverse, so impossible to pin down a specific definition of it? Or what do you think? I wish I could read anything you're writing in the chat, but obviously I can't. I just try and imagine it. Okay. Yeah, well, let's look at some examples of accommodation with the final part, some tips, which I think you can use, I would say you can use in any classroom. So tip one is kind of responding to the kind of characteristics of neurologically diverse people, if you like. One of which is their fear of the unknown and the need for structure. So structure and repetition is reassuring. A lack of structure and repetition is scary. So, but I mean, this can also be true for students who are not neurologically diverse, right? May also be other students who have a fear of the unknown and need structure to thrive. It's not a particularly unusual experience or feeling to have. So how can we deal with this? Well, of course, we can set clear lesson and course objectives. So students know, what is coming to, not only do they know what is coming today, but they also know where this is leading. The neurologically diverse person is likely to want to know, yeah, okay, fair enough. Today we're learning the present perfect. Fine. Okay, get it. Present perfect. Useful. But then where is this all leading? Like, why are we doing this? What is this all leading to? Like, what is the point? What is the overall mission here, so to speak? They want to know when things are going to happen, where things are going to happen, if that's relevant, how everything is going to happen, and if possible, why everything is going to happen. Why we're learning the present perfect. Okay, fine. Yeah, I can easily remember how to form the present perfect. No problem. I can remember all of those past participles. Fine. But why are we learning the present perfect? What is the benefit of that? How is that going to help me in life? That's what a neurologically diverse person is generally going to want to know. But of course, your typical curious student is also going to want to know that too, I would imagine. So yeah, tip 2, as I mentioned earlier, the tendency towards perfectionism. Or does anyone have any students who have this tendency, whether they're neurologically diverse or not? I suspect you do. Of course, there are also people who are not neurologically diverse who have a tendency towards perfectionism. Perhaps they have this people-pleasing thing going on. So how do we deal with this tendency towards perfectionism, which, as I said, can cause kind of mental distress as the student worries that their work is not good enough, and which can also lead to them working so hard that they become exhausted, neither of which outcome is good. What can we do about this? Well, we can set clear and manageable objectives for tasks. Okay, so for example, the aim is not to deliver a perfect, fluent sounding, natural sounding presentation. The aim is to communicate 3 points about a specific topic clearly, perhaps. And this is all part of fostering a culture where not getting everything right is perfectly okay, where making mistakes is encouraged, where making mistakes is seen as a positive thing from which you can learn and improve. So it's all about, creating a culture where, it's okay if your work is not perfect. It's okay to not get everything right all the time. You can learn from it if you make mistakes, and really making sure that students are aware of that and that this is clear. So you could also bring this into, say, your assessment materials and your evaluation materials. This kind of sense of, what we're aiming for is not perfection. What we're aiming for is not 100% on the test. Okay. So, tip 3. The way that neurodiverse students focus, as in focus on their work. So this is a bit of an interesting area because in some respects, as I mentioned earlier, neurologically diverse people may have this kind of hyper focus where, they're able to concentrate for long periods of time uninterrupted. On the other hand, they may struggle to concentrate. So it's kind of all or nothing. This is kind of like a general rule of thumb when it comes to neurodiversity, this kind of all or nothing. We cannot be like middle of the road. We have to be like 0% or 100%. So on the one hand, you may need to allow neurologically diverse students to take breaks when they need to, if this is possible. This can also be a reason why neurologically diverse people struggle in mainstream schools, because they're not able to take breaks when they want to or need to. And yeah, understand that a lack of focus does not necessarily mean a lack of interest or application. Often a lack of focus, especially in a person with ADHD, for example, although this can also be true of people on the autism spectrum. A lack of focus is, like I said, not a sign of a lack of interest or application. It's often a result of the kind of inner mental chaos and this kind of mental hyperactivity becoming too much to deal with. And, that is requiring so much attention and so much kind of, energy, basically, that that the person is not able to focus on anything else apart from trying to deal with this inner chaos. That's usually the reason why neurologically diverse people struggle to focus, because the kind of the film that's going on in their head is sort of drowning everything else out. So, of course, that's something you need to keep in mind. You need to try and have an open channel of communication with them about how they're feeling. Are they experiencing this mental hyperactivity or not? So, try and be responsive to that as far as possible. But at the same time, do not disturb them when they are in flow. This is also with me, the thing that irritates me the most in the whole world, probably not something you would expect, but the thing that irritates me the most in the whole world is obviously global warming, bad, clearly, but otherwise, the worst thing is when I'm working and I'm in flow and someone in my family comes and starts talking to me. I cannot cope with that. I will seriously get quite aggressive. It's really almost like physically unpleasant for me to be interrupted when I'm in flow. So maybe try and identify, if you have neurological diverse students, try and identify when they are in flow and then don't disturb them. The tendency to have strong opinions, especially something you see with people with autism spectrum disorder, they have strong opinions and they have a strong sense of like what is right and what is wrong. I remember when I was a child, a man who used to work for Nestle came around to see my grandma, and I had a big go at him about how awful Nestle was, much to my grandma's disgust. And we do tend to have strong opinions, especially when it comes to questions of what is right or wrong, what is okay and what is not okay. And we're often not afraid to let people know about that. So I think that in response to that, teachers should be open to challenges that students may make on their opinions or the opinion of other students. In any way they challenge other people's opinions in the classroom, it's not coming from a malicious place. It's just it's coming from this kind of visceral sense of, I have to let it out. I can't keep it in. It's not our intention to be rude. We don't see this as rude. We see this as doing the right thing. If you say something and I disagree with it, I see it as doing the right thing to correct you, to disagree with you and put you right. I feel like I'm doing you a favor by, telling you, that you've got it wrong. So of course, this can also, if we harness this correctly, this can lead to healthy debate, which can be beneficial for all students. And the final tip, as I mentioned earlier, this issue of hypersensitivity. So communicate clearly and unambiguously. I think a lot of neurologically typical people don't realize that they are communicating ambiguously when, for the neurologically diverse person's perspective, they are. For just by not spelling, sometimes we really need you to spell it out. And if you're not spelling it out, that is for us ambiguous. And that can lead to paranoia, which can lead to mental hyperactivity, which can lead to a lack of focus. So it's kind of this vicious cycle. So try not to allow room for false interpretation of your words, by being as specific as possible. And appreciate that your words and actions may have a deeper impact on neurodiverse students than on other students. So yeah, neurologically diverse people, you have to be careful if you want to criticize them or give negative feedback. You have to be really careful about how you do that, because they can easily interpret that as, you know, the world is ending, especially children and young people who have not yet developed the kind of greater, that kind of armor, you know, that kind of greater robustness to be able, and that, you know, which just comes from experience. You know, I've experienced feedback like this before and I didn't die, so I guess this time I'm not going to die either. But perhaps when you're younger, you're still in that, you know, if this happens, this is terrible. So yeah, just this kind of awareness of hypersensitivity is key. Okay, yeah, and finally, the tendency to have a lack of a filter. So this is this kind of uninhibited behavior in the classroom, which I know my son exhibits. Try not to punish this, and appreciate that students may have no control over this behavior. If you want to bring them back and get them out of it, try to engage them with something they're interested in. Of course, you have to know what they're interested in. You have to find that out. But just by getting them, you can easily get them out of it just by talking to them, starting a conversation with them about something they're interested in. Okay, I have really talked a lot. Yeah, now we have some time for some questions or comments. As I said, I haven't been able to read any of your comments in the chat. So yeah, be really interested to hear what you think. Yeah.
Thanks, Claire. That was so interesting, and it's just, thank you so much. It's so interesting hearing your point of view as an expert teacher, but also someone who has personal experience of this topic. So thank you. There are a lot of questions actually in the chat. So let's see how many we can talk about, if that's okay with you. So first question is from James Gilbert. He says, "Hi Claire, I noticed you said my husband has autism.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say this is preferable to he is autistic?"
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, with these things, it's all kind of subjective. What does preferable mean? But most people who have autism would prefer the term have autism. And also, you may have noticed I also said live with autism. I'm sure I said. Some people would say that like live with is even better than have. Most or many people who have autism dislike the term be autistic, because it kind of suggests that your autism completely defines you.
Yeah.
And they don't think that autism should completely define someone, which I understand. Yeah, so in many cases, yeah, I personally prefer have autism or live with autism. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really interesting and helpful to understand how we should talk about these issues. Okay, so interesting what you're going to say about this. So Ocharya, sorry if I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, says, "How can a teacher best manage a student with neurodiversity if the student becomes violent?"
Oh, okay. Tricky. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is from your personal experience or a hypothetical. But if a child or student becomes violent, it's because they really cannot cope in the situation that they're in for whatever reason. Perhaps there's too much noise, or, you know, some kind of sensory unpleasantness or social unpleasantness as they perceive it. So if an autistic or if a neurologically diverse child of any kind is becoming violent, it's because they just really cannot cope. You know, it's not, you know, malicious.
Yes.
So you have to obviously keep that in mind, that there must be something which is seriously wrong. And then you have to consider what could that be? And obviously that will depend on the context, what exactly is going on there. It could, it's likely to be some kind of sensory thing. As I said, too much noise, perhaps you can do something about that. You can, people often say, if a child is in a classroom and it's too loud, let them take a little break outside and then come back. So yeah, all you can do is try to identify what exactly is upsetting that child so severely. And often asking the child is not going to do any good at all. Saying, what is upsetting you, they often won't be able to give you a coherent answer. You have to try and be a detective and figure it out yourself.
Okay, thank you. So that's really useful to understand what some of the problems could be then if the child at that point is it's an overload and they can't
or I guess what I didn't mention is kind of this sense of uncertainty. Uncertainty can also be kind of this uncertainty, lack of structure can also be triggering in that way too. It's not necessarily sensory things.
Okay, and is this what we call hypersensitivity? We've got a question that's come through from Facebook about strategies to deal with hypersensitivity. Is that a similar thing?
Yeah, I guess it's kind of connected. How to deal with hypersensitivity? Well, yeah, as I said, often hypersensitivity is kind of triggered by a lack of being specific. Ambiguity triggers hypersensitivity. So a lack of clear communication triggers hypersensitivity. So as I said, just really kind of spelling things out and being, completely transparent and explaining, for example, if you have given a student negative feedback, explaining why and explaining what that means. So, just really communicating in an unambiguous way is the best way to deal with hypersensitivity, or to avoid triggering it, rather.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So ideally, we don't want to get to that situation where the student is,
of course,
is in that kind of is blocking or really upset. But that's interesting what you say about explaining what things mean. So maybe if you give sometimes students working on something and you give them some feedback that something is wrong, but would it help to also say, but this doesn't matter because this is not your final mark, or you've got a chance to change this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. Making clear what is important and what is not, what mistakes make a difference and what mistakes are not a big deal. Or say with learning English, what mistakes are kind of acceptable at your level. Say if you're A2, but you make a certain mistake, that's fine at A2 level. That's acceptable okay, you made a mistake, but we consider this mistake to be acceptable at A2 level, so fine,
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. Okay, so just to summarize, because I think that's really important what we were talking about. So you could, if you think the problem could be it's too noisy, then you could ask them to go outside. What other things might cause kind of problems with hypersensitivity?
Well, as strange as it may sound, perhaps like clothing. Clothing can be very irritating for some neurologically diverse people, or even an unpleasant smell.
Right.
Just any kind of or just a large number of people. For example, my children, when they were younger, they were very triggered by being in airports. It's just awful because of the combination of the noise, unusual smells, lots of crowds of people.
Okay, thank you. That's so interesting and good to know. So maybe a change of scene, if it's at all possible, could be the solution to lots of things.
I mean, obviously you don't really want to, it could be seen as excluding the neurologically diverse child to step out. But if there's no other way, if it's not possible in any other way to reduce the volume, and the volume is what's triggering, then obviously that's the best thing to do.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, another interesting question from Camila. What is teaching like for neurodivergent teachers?
Interesting question. I think you do find quite a lot of neurologically diverse teachers within ELT. And I think that's because, or at least this has been my experience, and I know experience of other neurologically diverse people, that we can sort of put on a different mask when we're teaching. You know, we can put on this teacher mask, and when you're in teacher mode with the teacher mask, you can be more assertive and you can be less socially awkward. As a teacher, you're kind of given permission to be, you know, you have to be the kind of rock star standing at the front and conducting the orchestra, to mix my metaphors. So in that sense, it can be very freeing and very pleasant for neurologically diverse people to take on that role of teachers. But of course, they do tend to have this lack of assertiveness, which they may not be able to overcome. That can be a challenge. And their kind of hypersensitivity may also have a negative impact on how they teach, because they may be unnecessarily worried about what their students think of them.
Yeah, I can see that, definitely. Are there any advantages, do you think, to being a neurodivergent teacher?
Well, I mean, you could say the tendency to perfectionism could be an advantage for a neurologically diverse person, a neurologically diverse teacher, because the neurologically diverse teacher will put in so much effort into their lesson planning and their materials usually, and, you know, try to make sure everything is perfect that could be perfect. And I think, you know, contrary to popular perception, neurologically diverse people tend to have a lot of empathy. So I think that helps them, and they tend to be very patient as well. Of course, generalization, but, you know, they tend to have qualities that make a good teacher in that way, if they can overcome their kind of social awkwardness and difficulty in asserting themselves.
Yes, definitely. Okay, let's see if we've got time for another question. Okay, so Anisha says, this sounds like a real life situation. I have a student, he doesn't speak in everyone's presence. He just speaks with me in everyone's absence. I tried finding out the problem, I could not see any. Do you have any tips for this situation?
Well, yeah, obviously I don't know the situation personally, but if that's happening, I can only assume that the child or student, for whatever reason, obviously feels uncomfortable with speaking around the other students. Yeah, it's difficult to know why exactly that might be. That might just be, it could just be as simple as fear of rejection. Fear of, if I speak, other students will reject me, they'll see me as not good enough. It could be, you know, I just, for some neurologically diverse people, it's just, I don't want to speak. I don't want to, I don't want to, you know, I don't need that social interaction. All I need is, I'm in a school, I'm here to learn. I need the teacher. I know I definitely had this attitude as a student to some extent. I'm here to learn. I can learn from the teacher. The only interaction I need is with the teacher. You know, that's what school about. You come to school to learn stuff from teachers. This can be a typical perception. So obviously, in order to deal with this, you have to show the teacher the benefits, show the student the benefits of interacting with other students, because or they're either too scared or too inhibited to interact with other students, or they don't see the benefits of doing that. So you need to either, or, you know, see if you can find out which of those it is, and then try to either reduce their inhibitions if it's that, or show them the benefits of interacting with other students. It's probably likely to be a combination of the two.
Okay, I like it. That's really a really nice way of putting it. And then is there a point where you would stop pushing, you would kind of encourage, and then at the end give an understanding that, okay, well, everyone's different and everyone participates in different ways?
Yeah. I mean, that is the thing with neurologically diverse people. You have to kind of be careful with your pushing of them, because they can be quite stubborn and can be like, I know what you're doing here. You're trying to encourage me to do this thing that I don't want to do. I'm not going to fall for that. So I think, you know, it has to be, you know, very gently, softly, and gradual. If you want to change their behavior, for example, you want to get them to speak to other students, that's going to be a massive change for them. So in order for that to happen, it's going to have to be a gradual process, you know, no pushing.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
Okay. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but that has been so interesting. Thank you. I could stay here all day. And I'm sure our audience could as well. We've got many questions for you, so we'd love to have you back to tell us more another time. But thank you so much, Claire.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who's attended. We're going to go in 15 minutes to our next session with Jane Delaney. Thanks to Marcus on Facebook and Kath, who has also helped with moderation, along with Melissa for this session. So thanks everybody, and see you in 15 minutes for the start of the next one.